What's up, guys? This is episode 16 of the vlog. This is pretty awesome. We made so much progress, and now it's time to add some tests for our Rubygem simple calendar. Now, we have a bunch of tests that we kind of wrote up as we're going along, kind of thinking about like what tests are we actually going to need. And a lot of this has evolved now that we have the calendar code available to us. So let me just open these up here and let's take a look at what we've got. We've got two public methods, and that means that these two methods are ones we certainly want to test, and the private methods are going to be the ones that are a little less important to test, but we're going to make sure that they are appropriately tested so that the public methods don't break. And the reason for that is because those public methods call all those private methods. So you have partial name, we have date range, start date, sorted events, attribute. All of those are actually testing or being used in our code somewhere. So we obviously want to write tests for those. But if you were to write more of an integration level test, a higher level test that would just do the two renders, that could work. You could write a test that says, hey, when we instantiate a calendar, let's make sure that we test that it prints out a calendar onto the page. We could use, you could do the full integration test and make sure that the HTML that gets printed out is what you want and what you expect. We could definitely do that, or we could do a little bit more finer grained and do unit tests. I think what I'm going to do is unit tests for this because the higher level tests are going to be more important if we ever make those views a little bit more complicated. So long as we don't screw those up much, they're really simple, but they're a little less important. We need to make sure that our partial name is converting the class name to a file name appropriately. We need to make sure that the attribute returns the correct values. We want to make sure that sorted events does the right thing. We want to make sure that these pieces work. And the view is a little more flexible because everybody's going to customize it. So that is kind of where we're at with testing. We want to make sure that the stuff that should always work in one specific way, we can unit test those because that's what they're designed to do, just very straightforward stuff. When it comes to these things that are going to be a little bit more malleable, like this, what happens after the render happens? Well, you should have HTML on your page. This should return a string of HTML at least. And that is one of those things that is a little harder to unit test, or you tie yourself in really closely with unit tests, and that becomes more complicated. So let's figure out what we need to do here. Now, one of the more complicated pieces that we've got to deal with here is the view context. We're actually using this to represent the view. So in our test, we're going to want to make sure that this is like either nil or a test double so that we can call methods on it and just, ignore what they do. But sometimes we use that view context to call like a method render. And that's going to be important that we make sure that we call that method. And, this is one of those pieces that becomes sort of the bane of testing. You have to make these fake variables because you don't have the real thing. And that's where testing kind of goes off the rails right now. That is where you spend most of your time dealing with those little things where you're like, look, I don't really have a real Rails application in the gem tests, so we have to fake some of that, and you end up writing a lot of code just to set things up. So ideally, if you can get by with not doing much of that, not much of the fake Rails setup as before, that's the way that you want to write your tests. So let's just dive in and start some simple tests here. I think the easiest things that we can do is test this partial name here. Now that's going to be most obviously the easiest one in theory. So we actually should look for any of our tests in here and see if we have a render test. It doesn't look like we do. So let's go up here and say it renders, or it let's see, it renders a partial with the same name as the class. So let's make this test here, and we're going to do simple calendar calendar.new, and we're going to send the private method, and we're going to call partial name, and that'll allow us to call this private method from inside of our test. And we want this to, we expect this to equal calendar. So that's what we expect, and we should be able to run Rspec and see if that works. So we get a failed test, and we get wrong number of arguments, 0 for 1, 2. And let's see, partial name, I don't believe, has self.class.name underscore. So it doesn't look like what we've written in our test has anything wrong with this. We should be able to, if we were to do something like our bin console command, if we were to run this, we get the same error. So actually, our issue is with this. So that's interesting. So our Rspec syntax is fine, but if we create a new calendar object, aha! That's important. We forgot to pass in the view context and the options, or the options. And here we can pass in a nil because we don't need the view context here. So we set that variable, and we don't need the view at all because we're just looking at the class name and the underscore of that. So we know that we're running the correct test because it failed, and that's good. And if we run Rspec again, we're going to get the same thing because I forgot to save the file. Run it again, and this time we get a different one. Now this is important because we wanted to make sure that it failed, but I didn't actually mention that. So we actually want to make sure that our tests fail first, and you could test that by doing like equal to an empty string, just so long as you get a red test so that you know that what you're doing is providing the correct output so that you can verify that it's doing the right thing. And because of the module that we're using, simple calendar module, the underscore method converts that to the module here, and then the slash to represent the folder name, and calendar after that. So this is what our actual test should look like, and if we run Rspec for that, we get a passing test way up here at the top before all of our pending tests. So that's great. We really have our first test working, and that's all we really need. Now we can do some things here. We could set, like we could do a let, and you could say let calendar be equal to simple calendar calendar.new nil, and we could have this to clean up some of the setup stuff that we have, and that allows our tests to be a little bit shorter, and then within all of these tests, we can just access the calendar variable here, and that'll let us set it up just the one time in one place and not have to do that every single test. We get the same output, we got a passing test again, and we can use that as we go through. So let's also take a look at the attribute one. Now, this is another one where we could use, so we could write a test for the this calendar, but in this case we need to pass in some options here. So we need two tests here. We need first one to test that it has a default, and then we need another that we can override that attribute, the default attribute for the meetings. So let's do that. Let's make a context for event attribute. Event sorting attribute might be a better way to describe it. And here we can have a test that it has start time as the default attribute, and then another, it allows you to override the default attribute. Okay, so for each of these tests, we really just want to instantiate a new calendar, and we can do that. We'll just copy this. We can actually, I believe, use the calendar from above, and we could say expect calendar.send attribute to equal start time. And here we can actually say simple calendar.new and pass in the attribute option. We'll do starts at, and we can expect that to, we also need the send attribute to equal starts at. And that should allow us to have two tests that basically handle both options for that event situation. And as you can see, both of those are correctly passing, which is great. Yeah, that's really all we need. This attribute method, just we need to make sure that it overrides this accordingly, and it defaults to start time. It's really all we're doing, which is nice, and that kind of takes care of these two pieces. So it takes care of a section of the render block because we're calling the partial name. And this also takes care of somewhat of the sorted events, because now in sorted events we don't have to make any tests for this. We can assume that that's going to return the correct value, and once we write a test for that one, we can go ahead and just kind of trust that it works. Now the sorted events method is going to be a little bit more complicated. We're going to need to create a fake class with that attribute or struct of some sort, so that we have a start time or starts at. We need to make sure that that is handled and sorted, and we take an array and convert it into a hash organized by dates. So what we'll probably do with that one is we'll have a context of it converts an array of events to a hash sorted by days. So we'll have this context, and in here we'll have our tests for that specific piece of functionality in our tests, in our gem. So another thing you could do is you could do something like describe, and you could do the method. There's a whole bunch of the method names, so you could do sorted events or whatever. There's a whole bunch of different ways to define your tests, and really it just kind of doesn't matter so long as you run the tests. This is one of those things where Rspec is great, but there's so many people arguing about should you use context, should you use describe, it blocks, expect this to equal that, or could it just be an assert, or just, do a regular Ruby evaluation. This is one of those things that people get very opinionated on, and I personally like using Minitest because it's just straight Ruby rather than all of the extra things that you can do in Rspec. You can't actually easily refactor Rspec code out or Capybara or some of those things because it's not just the regular old Ruby that you're used to. So it makes things a little bit more complicated, but by all means, simple is better. That's all I'm looking for. I'm happy to use Rspec and just keep it simple. So I'm going to leave these as a pending thing. Let's actually change this to describe sorted events. And this makes more sense to describe a test rather than that. So we'll have that as our pending test there. And I'm just going to jump down to the start date, date range, and additional days. And we'll handle those rather than dealing with sorted events yet. I think we'll tackle that tomorrow because it's going to take a little bit more setup than we would expect. Now, another thing you might have noticed is we haven't done any tests for view context or options. So we've just kind of handled the setup in our test, but we've never explicitly tested the initialize method. We can add tests for it, but at the same time, is it going to make that much difference? We take two variables, as arguments. We assign them directly to two variables. There's no magic that happens here. If this ever changes, our tests will probably break. And yeah, we can write a test for it, but you have to ask yourself the question of how much is too detailed, because we don't want to have to struggle with our tests all the time. We have plenty more valuable things to do with our time in the future. So let's jump into describing these last three, maybe just two methods actually. I don't really feel like we need to test additional days as much because it only applies to this calendar, and it actually gets covered if we handle the date range. So that's something that's interesting that we can do here and kind of skip that piece, which is nice. So here, if we have to test our start date method, this is one where so another thing we need to do is the same as the default attribute for the calendar attribute name. We need to test the default, and we need to test the overriding. Now here we can just say it defaults to today's date, and we need to use double quotes for that one, and do, and then the other one, it uses the params. Let's see, what's a good way of explaining that? It uses the params start date to override it? This is not very descriptive. I'm not thinking very clearly right now. Maybe you can clean up the text or description for that test, because it's kind of, it literally says what it means, but it's not useful in the context of what does the start date do. This is really like the start date is designed so that we know where to calculate the calendar from, so that you can go between different views. That is a better way of describing it, but at the same time, that's really what the date range calculates. So we're going to actually need to jump from here to the date range and test a little bit more around this. Like, really, the start date doesn't do anything except it defaults to the current day, or it uses the one in the params. And the date range is the one that actually does all the magic, and we need to test that one more importantly than anything else. So that one is where things actually happen. So in this case, we have a calendar. So we have this calendar, and we can send the start date method name. We expect this to equal date.today. And this is all fine and dandy, but when we run our tests, we're going to experience the expected problem of it can't. Oh, first we have a syntax error, I believe. Where is that? It says syntax error, line 49, and it's totally correct. What are we missing? Do. Let's remove that. Ah, there we go. Totally was missing an end there, right? No. What are we missing? Ha ha ha. Is it in here somewhere? No. There it is. We had a do at the end of that line. Silly me. You probably saw that a few minutes ago, but you couldn't tell me. So, okay, we've got this test, but the problem is our view context is nil, and view context doesn't have a method called params. So what are we going to do about that? Well, one of the easiest things that you can do is make a fake class to represent something inside your test, and you can use that to override things and simulate Rails functionality, but in your tests. So we can actually have a method called params here. And what if we just have an attribute and it's called start date, def initialize start date at start date equals start date, and params just returns at start date. So this is going to be a helper class that's going to allow us to pass in a calendar, pass in a view context, rather. So if we have view context.new, we can pass in any date that we want, and this would allow us to simply do that. So if we do this and we have a calendar equals simple calendar calendar.new view context, this is going to allow us to call this method. It will hit our fake params and return the start date, which is going to be actually completely empty. So this is one of those things too that if at start date, we need to make sure params returns a hash, because that is what Rails does. So if there's a start date, we want start date equal to at start date. And if there's not, we just want to return an empty hash. So this is actually the correct code that we want for that. So if you've given us one, and we can do present if you like, so it's a little more clear to read. If there's one, we'll return that in the hash. If there's not, we won't. Simple as that. That should simulate the hash. So if there is no start date in the URL, in the params hash, then it shouldn't get passed over. And that should allow us to run this test again. And undefined method attribute this time. Where was that? So we have calendar spec, line number 4. Attribute. What am I doing? Adder accessor. I am not thinking clearly today. So now let's run this test, and we get a failing test, wrong number of arguments, 0 for 1. Now this crashed on calendar spec line 7, which is interesting. So it came here, initialize, and we got to start date, and wrong number of arguments. Oh, that is because we have to pass in something here. So let's set this to nil by default, and then this should allow our test to run, because that will now be optional. So that is awesome. That allows us to have a fake view context that allows our view context in our code to just fake itself and actually work. But this is the work that sucks about writing tests. You have to fake out all the stuff that Rails provides in order to make your tests run. So you're not working against the real code, and obviously there's better ways to do this, but I'm wanting to point this out, that this is regular old Ruby that we're doing, and we're cheating because we're using different types of objects. We could use test doubles or mocks or whatever to sort of simulate this and set things up and fake it, but just as easily we can write regular old Ruby classes to pull that off instead. So this is cool. If we change this code to always return the params hash, we'll notice that this should be a little bit different. And it fails because it tried to call toDate on nil. So it returned this and it was nil. So that means that our fake view context class is working, and while there's a little bit of setup here, it's definitely not the worst thing in the world. This is, designed to kind of point out and explain how to think about tests so that they're not this magical thing. They're really just Ruby code, and you're calling the same code as you had before, but you're cheating a little bit because this time you don't have Rails available to you in the same manner as you did before. And now we can take this and we can say, let's do date.yesterday, and this should be date.yesterday. And in theory, if we run this test on line 48, that should pass. And it does. It did not fail. So if we change this, and let's just make sure that it that it fails if we set up the wrong thing, and it does. And this is awesome because what we've done in just about 10 lines of code or something there, we've written a little class that we can replace and pass into our gem, and it fakes the params hash and the views, does all this stuff, and then really we call our code just as we normally would, and we can pass in and customize these dates, and we don't have to use anything like time cop where you like change global Ruby times or any of that stuff. We can purely do this all on our own without any gems, without any helpers. Like, this is all that we've got. We've got regular old Ruby code that genuinely tests our code and makes sure that it works. The only downside to this is that view context now has to accurately represent Ruby's view context. The code has to match up. Otherwise, if Rails changes, then this is going to have to change or it will break. But all in all, we can write some really, really easy tests and be pretty confident that what we're doing works. So I'm actually going to cut it short here because this is a lot of stuff to take in, but yeah, testing is actually really super duper easy. It's just regular old Ruby code. You're just making sure that things equal each other. You don't have to worry about Rspec or any of these like extra gems like shoulda or whatever. You don't have to worry about mocks or doubles or any of that stuff. It's regular old Ruby code. That's what I want to get across. So hopefully that makes sense, and I will talk to you next episode. Peace.